didn't cry when my husband died. People thought that was strange. My daughter-in-law pulled me aside at the reception and said, "You know, it's okay to feel something." I looked at her and said, "I feel everything. I just don't owe it to you." That was 3 years before the stroke. 3 years before I understood what she had really meant by that. My name is Loretta. I am 73 years old, and I have spent the better part of my adult life building something from nothing. Not metaphorically, literally from nothing. My late husband, Charles, and I started with 40 acres of dry land in central Kentucky and a farmhouse that had a roof that leaked in 4 places. We patched it ourselves. We grew tobacco first, then soybeans, then Christmas trees on the back acres when the market shifted. We added a grain elevator in 1998. We refinanced twice. We almost lost everything in 2008 like half the county did. But we didn't. When Charles passed, the accountant sat me down and told me the estate was worth just over $9 million. Land, equipment, the elevator, 2 rental properties in town, and a money market account Charles had been quietly feeding for 20 years without telling me. I remember sitting in that office and thinking, we built this. Both of us. With bad backs and early mornings and skipped vacations and one trip to the Smoky Mountains that we cut short because the tractor needed a new part. I kept all of it. I didn't know what to do with it, so I just kept it. I kept working the farm with the help of a man named Roy, who had worked for us since 2003 and knew every inch of that land better than my own sons did. I have 2 sons. Warren is 51. He lives 40 minutes away and works in insurance. My younger son Dale is 48. He moved to Nashville 12 years ago to pursue something he described as opportunities and never elaborated on. He calls on birthdays and Christmas, and occasionally when he needs something. I also have a daughter-in-law, Sherry, Warren's wife. I want to be precise about Sherry because she's the kind of person who is very difficult to describe fairly. She's not a bad person in the way that villains are bad people. She is the kind of person who smiles at everything and means very little of it. She organizes things. She keeps lists. She has opinions about estate planning, and she shares them often, whether the subject has come up or not. In the 2 years after Charles died, I noticed something shift. Warren started coming by more often, not to help, not really, to look. He would walk the property with his hands in his pockets and say things like, "You know, this land could be worth a lot more if you developed the back 40. Or, have you thought about what happens to the elevator if you can't run it anymore?" I was 71. I was running a $9 million farm. I did not feel like someone who needed to be asked about what happens when she can't anymore. Dale flew in for Thanksgiving the year after Charles passed and spent most of the meal talking about a real estate investment opportunity in Nashville that just needed a bit of starting capital. I passed him the green bean casserole and changed the subject. He did not let it go. By the time we got to the pie, he had mentioned it 4 times. I went to bed that night and lay in the dark and thought about Charles, about how he used to say that money changes people the way water changes rock, slowly, invisibly, until you look up one day and the whole shape has shifted. I did not want to believe that about my sons. I had raised them. I had packed their lunches and driven them to baseball practice and sat in the bleachers in the cold and cheered until my throat hurt. I had loved them the way you love something you made yourself, with your whole body. But I started paying attention. That's all I did at first. I just started really watching. I noticed that Warren never asked about my health unless it was followed by something else. I noticed that Dale's calls got longer and more personal right around the time I mentioned, offhandedly, that I was thinking about updating my will. I noticed that Sherry had started asking questions about the rental properties, not casual questions, specific ones, assessed values, lease terms, what happened to a property when the owner passed without a trust. That last one she asked at Easter dinner, in front of everyone, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I put my fork down. I looked at her. She smiled. I picked my fork back up and said, "More ham?" But I was not the same person after that question. Something had closed in me, quietly, the way a window closes before a storm. I called my attorney the following week. His name is Philip, and he had handled Charles's estate, and before that had done the paperwork when we bought the grain elevator. He is a careful man. He doesn't rush. I appreciate that about him. I told him what I was thinking. I told him I wanted to put everything into a revocable living trust, with a separate irrevocable trust for the bulk of the land assets, with specific conditions on distributions. I told him I wanted to name a trustee who was not my son, Warren, not my son Dale, and not anyone related to either of them by marriage. He didn't blink. He said, "That's a very reasonable thing to want. Who did you have in mind?" I had thought about this. I had thought about it for several weeks. And the person I kept coming back to was not a lawyer, not a financial advisor, not even a close friend. It was a woman named Bertie. Bertie had been my neighbor for 31 years. She lived on the property east of ours, and when Charles got sick the first time, back in 2015, Bertie showed up at my door with a pot of chicken soup and a pound cake, and she did not say a single word about it. She just handed me the food and said, "I'll be back Tuesday," and she was. Every Tuesday for 6 weeks. She sat with me while Charles went through his tests and his fear and his recovery, and she never once made it about herself or made me feel like a burden. Bertie was also a retired accountant, 30 years with a firm in Louisville, before she moved back to the county to take care of her mother and stayed because she said the quiet suited her. Philip thought this was a good choice. We spent 3 appointments getting everything structured correctly. The farm and the elevator went into the irrevocable trust. The rental properties went into an LLC that fed into the living trust. The money market account stayed in my name for now, for operating expenses. The conditions on distributions were specific: charitable giving to the county agricultural extension program, and a life interest in the farmhouse for me. And after that, Bertie, as trustee, would determine the use and distribution based on the stated intentions I had written out in the 12-page letter. My sons were not mentioned by name anywhere in the documents. I did not tell them any of this. I want to explain why, because I have thought about this a great deal and I want to be honest about it. I did not do this out of anger. I was not punishing them. I was protecting what Charles and I had built from people who had started to see it as something they were entitled to before I was even finished living. There is a difference between punishment and protection. And I understood the difference very clearly by the time I signed those papers. I finished the restructuring in October. By December, I had a mild stroke. It happened on a Wednesday morning. I was in the kitchen making coffee and my left hand stopped working and the room tilted and I sat down on the floor without meaning to. Roy found me 20 minutes later and called 911. By the time the ambulance arrived, I could speak again. But my left side was weak, and they wanted me admitted for observation. I was in the hospital for 4 days. The stroke was described as moderate. My neurologist, a very direct young woman with short hair and an efficient manner that I immediately respected, told me I would likely regain full function with physical therapy, and that I needed to significantly reduce my stress. I almost laughed. I was in my room on the 3rd day when Warren arrived. He had Sherry with him, and she was carrying a tote bag, which I thought was a kind gesture, until I noticed she was also carrying a manila folder. Dale came in behind them. He had flown up from Nashville. He said he'd been so worried. He hugged me carefully, like I was something that might break. I was wearing a hospital gown, and I had an IV in my arm, and I had lost some feeling in my left hand, and I was lying in a bed in a room that smelled like antiseptic. And my sons and my daughter-in-law stood at the foot of that bed, and I watched their faces and I thought, I know what the folder is. Sherry put the tote bag on the chair by the window and she said she'd brought me some things: moisturizer, a better pillow, the crossword book I liked. She said it with warmth, and she meant it, I think. And then she placed the manila folder on the bed tray and Warren cleared his throat. He said they'd been talking, all of them, about how much I had on my plate. He said they were worried. He said they just wanted to make sure that if anything happened, everything was in order. He said the word order 3 times in 2 minutes. Dale chimed in. He said he just wanted to be sure I was protected. I looked at my younger son and I thought about the Thanksgiving table. I thought about 4 mentions of real estate investment over 1 meal. I thought about what it meant to frame taking as protecting. Sherry opened the folder. It was a durable power of attorney document, already prepared, a financial POA granting Warren full authority over my accounts and assets in the event of incapacity. There was also a second document, a deed transferring the farm property into a joint tenancy with right of survivorship, with Warren. A notary was waiting in the hallway. I learned this when Dale mentioned it, almost casually, like it was a logistical detail rather than the most significant fact in the room. I did not say anything for a long moment. I remember looking at the window. The view from my room was a parking structure and a stretch of pale winter sky. A crow landed on one of the concrete barriers and sat there, completely still. I looked back at my sons. Warren was watching me with an expression he probably thought was concern. Dale was looking at the floor. Sherry had the pen in her hand. I said, "Warren." He said, "Mom." I said, "How long have you had these documents prepared?" He paused for just a second too long before he said, "We just wanted to be ready." I nodded. I reached out and I took the pen from Sherry's hand. She looked relieved. And then I set the pen down on the tray, very carefully, and I folded my hands over the blanket and I said, "I'd like you to leave now." The room went very quiet. Dale said my name. Warren started to say something about just wanting to have a conversation. Sherry picked up the folder, and I said again, quietly, without raising my voice, "I'd like you to leave." They left. I lay in that hospital bed, and I looked at the ceiling, and I felt something settle inside me that had been unsettled for a long time. Not peace exactly, more like clarity, like when the fog burns off, and you can see the actual shape of the land. I called Bertie from my hospital phone. It was 9 in the evening, and she answered on the second ring. I told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Did they have any idea about the trust?" I said, "No." She said, "Good." I was discharged after one more day. Roy picked me up. He drove me home in his truck, and we didn't talk much, which was fine. When we pulled up to the farmhouse, he said, "Anything you need, Miss Loretta, you just say the word." I thanked him and went inside. The house felt different when I walked in. It had always felt like Charles and mine, and after he passed, it had started to feel only like mine in a way that was sometimes lonely. But that evening, it felt like something I had chosen, not something I had inherited or settled into. Something I had actively decided to keep. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I thought about the 40 acres we had started with. I thought about the leaking roof and the refinancing and the long July afternoons in the fields. I thought about Charles counting seed money on the kitchen table late at night, the lamp making a small circle of light around his hands. I thought about my sons as boys. Warren at 9, serious and careful, always reading the instructions before he opened the box. Dale at 6, tumbling out of the hayloft and landing wrong and coming into the house already trying not to cry. I had loved those boys with everything I had. I had not known then what they would become, or maybe I had seen it and had not let myself look at it. That is the part that is hardest to say, not that they betrayed me, but that I had seen it coming and had loved them anyway, and had done what I could with that knowledge and had protected what mattered. I started physical therapy the following week. My therapist was a young man named Curtis who was cheerful in a way that felt genuine rather than performed. He pushed me hard and I appreciated it. By February, I had most of the function back in my left hand. Warren called once in January. He said he was sorry if things had felt rushed at the hospital. He said he hoped I understood they were just worried. I said I appreciated him calling, and I said I hoped he had a good new year. I kept my voice even and warm, and I did not say any of the things I was thinking. Dale didn't call until March. I had a lot of time that winter to think about what I wanted my life to look like. Not the estate, not the documents, my actual life. I started going to church again. The small Baptist congregation out on Route 9 that Charles and I had attended for years before we got out of the habit. I started having Bertie over for dinner on Sundays. I started asking Roy about his family, his kids, his plans, questions I had not thought to ask often enough before. In April, Philip called me. He told me that Warren had retained an attorney and had filed a petition to be appointed as my guardian, claiming I lacked the capacity to manage my own affairs due to the stroke. I sat with that for a full minute before I said anything. Then I said, "What do I need to do?" Philip walked me through it. A guardianship petition in Kentucky requires a court evaluation. My neurologist submitted a detailed report documenting my full cognitive recovery. Bertie provided an affidavit. Roy provided one as well. Curtis, my physical therapist, provided documentation of my progress. Philip submitted the trust documents, which demonstrated that I had completed a complex multi-instrument estate restructuring months before the stroke, not after, not in a moment of confusion, but with full deliberateness and clear intention. The hearing was in June. I got dressed that morning in the blue dress Charles had always liked. I drove myself to the courthouse in town. I sat at the table with Philip and I answered every question the judge asked me clearly and completely. And I did not look at Warren more than once. He was sitting across the room with his attorney, and the one time I did look at him, he was looking at the table. Sherry was not there. Dale was not there. The petition was denied. The judge's language was specific. She noted that the petitioner had failed to demonstrate incapacity and that the respondent, me, had provided substantial evidence of deliberate financial planning undertaken prior to the medical event in question. She noted that the timing and nature of the petition raised concerns she felt compelled to acknowledge for the record. After it was over, Philip shook my hand outside on the courthouse steps. The sun was warm. There were redbuds blooming along the street, that particular purple pink that only lasts about 2 weeks in Kentucky before it's gone. I stood there in the sun, and I thought about all the mornings Charles and I had walked that farm before anyone else was awake. The way the dew sat on the soybeans, the sound of the combine in August, the long, slow accumulation of something built by 2 people who showed up year after year and did not stop. I had protected it, not because I didn't love my sons. I did love them, in the complicated, grieving way you love people who have disappointed you deeply and whom you cannot stop loving anyway. But love is not the same as surrender. I went home and made a pot of coffee and sat on the back porch and watched Roy turn the soil in the east field, the tractor moving in slow, deliberate rows, the land doing what it had always done, patient and permanent, beneath a wide Kentucky sky. Bertie came by that evening. She brought a pound cake, which she does for significant occasions. We sat on the porch until it got dark, and we talked about a great many things that had nothing to do with trusts or petitions or courtrooms. We talked about a book she had read. We talked about her daughter's new baby out in Colorado. We talked about whether the backfield was worth planting in wildflowers next season for the pollinators, which Roy had been suggesting for 2 years, and which I was finally ready to consider. The stars came out one by one over the farm, the same way they always had, the way they had come out every night for 40 years while Charles and I lived and worked under them. I was still here. The land was still mine, in all the ways that mattered. And the story, as someone once told me, was still my own to finish. I've thought a lot about the word deserve since everything happened. My sons believed they deserved that farm. Not because they had worked it, they hadn't. Not in any meaningful way, not in decades. But because they existed, because they were born into a family that built something, and somewhere along the way they confused being present at the beginning of a story with being entitled to write the ending of it. That is not how things work. That has never been how things work. That has never been how things work. What you receive in this life is almost never proportional to what you assume is owed to you. It is proportional to what you actually do. The choices you make quietly, when no one is watching, when there is no reward in sight. Charles understood that. He used to say that the farm didn't care about feelings. It cared about whether you showed up in the morning. I showed up. For 40 years I showed up. And then when it mattered most, I made a decision that required a different kind of showing up. Not physical, but deliberate. I sat with Philip and I told him what I needed, and I signed documents that my sons would never see coming. That was not luck. That was the accumulated result of paying attention, trusting my own instincts, and refusing to let love make me naive. Bertie once said something to me that I have turned over many times since. She said that wisdom is not the absence of trust. It is knowing where to place it. I had placed my trust in Warren and Dale for a long time, and not without reason. They were my children. I had made them. But trust is not a birthright you pass down. It is something earned, slowly, through actions that are small and consistent and unremarkable, precisely because they ask nothing in return. Bertie had been earning mine for 31 years. She showed up on Tuesdays with soup, and she never asked for anything. That is the whole of it. There is something I want to say about the hospital room, because I think about it still. When I took that pen from Sherry's hand and set it down on the tray, I was not performing strength. I was not making a point. I was simply being honest about what I knew. And I think that is what integrity actually looks like in practice. Not a grand gesture, not a speech, but a quiet refusal to pretend you don't see what you see. The hardest part was not the petition, not the courtroom, not even the stroke. The hardest part was accepting that my sons had made their choices freely and that I could not remake them. I could only make mine. And that is all any of us can do, really. We cannot control what people become. We can only decide what we protect, and why, and who we become in the process of protecting it. The farm is still here. Roy is still turning the soil. Bertie still comes on Sundays. The wildflowers went in on the back acres this spring, just like Roy had been suggesting, and they came up better than any of us expected. I am still here too. And the story, for now, is still mine to finish.